Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator for the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Chicago native and U.S. expat Brian Mier. Brian has lived in Brazil for almost 30 years. He is the co-editor of the English language publication Brasil Wire and the correspondent for Telesur's English news program from the South. He also edited the book Year of Lead, Washington, Wall Street, and New Imperialism in Brazil, which came out in 2019. Welcome to Brazil Unfiltered, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
So, Brian, let's just jump right in. With the campaign season in full swing in Brazil, what are your broad impressions? What do you see that's going to happen in the next month or two?
Well, there have been a lot of situations in which it looks like Bannon's, far-right network of international big data people, operatives, and things like that have managed to come up with big upward swings in candidates they support in the weeks leading up to elections. And we saw, for example, with Jeremy Corbyn in Great Britain, he had a big lead and then all of a sudden it just vanished. As of right now, the polls are stable in Brazil. The most recent poll came out by IPEC, which is former Ibope, yesterday, showing no change in the last 2 weeks, with Lula poised to win in the first round. One of the questions is, will he be able to hold on to a first round victory? I'm not sure. It seems like there will be some kind of upward surge in support for Bolsonaro in the next 4 weeks before the election. The big question, I think, is what will happen if Lula wins? Will Bolsonaro and the military allow him to take office? That's what I'm worried about.
So we're going to get back to that in a few minutes in this interview today. Let's talk about the recent presidential debate on the television networks on Band or Bandeirantes, which may up being the only presidential debate. It's not clear. It included 6 candidates: former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and current President Jair Bolsonaro, also presidential challenger and longtime politician Ciro Gomes, and Senator Simone Tebet, who comes from an important political family in Mato Grosso, representing the Brazilian Democratic Movement, and Senator Soraya Tornaqui, a far-right firebrand. And then finally, a political scientist, Felipe Davila, who is an unabashed pro-corporate neoliberal. Quite a few collection of characters. So to begin with, what are your impressions of the debate?
Well, I think the format was really unfortunate, right? I mean, everyone wanted to see Bolsonaro and Lula facing off for the whole time. It was a 3-hour debate. But because of Brazilian election law, all candidates who come from parties that have over 5 members of Congress are required to be in all of the debates. So, for example, Felipe Davila and Soraya Thornicki, they were polling at 0%, in a poll with 2% margin of error either way, 0%, and they were given just as much airtime as Lula and Bolsonaro were. Even Ciro Gomes, who's the 3rd most popular candidate, he's under 10%. So I feel like the format didn't really give what everyone in Brazil wanted to see, which was ample space for Lula and Bolsonaro to go head-to-head on their vision for Brazil. Because of that, there were a lot of situations where, for example, Simone Tebet would ask Lula a question, and in his answer, he would attack Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro would do the same thing when other candidates asked him questions. So it was a little awkward. I thought Lula's performance wasn't as good as his first global interview in 16 years earlier last week, which was a lot of people are saying that's one of the greatest interviews he's ever done in his life. So the expectation was really high for Lula, but he did get a few interesting comments in. And one highlight, I think, was talking about comparing gig economy workers to 21st century slaves. And another was saying that on his first day in office, if he's elected, he's going to erase all of President Bolsonaro's executive orders putting pieces of evidence under 100 years of classified status in different investigations against him and his sons.
Do you think the election debate will influence the outcome of the elections?
I don't think so. I don't think that one will. If there's more, that there could be. I feel like it might influence the outcome because I think Bolsonaro came away feeling not so insecure about his debating abilities because he didn't do it that bad. So maybe he'll participate in more debates because of this, and because of that, that might influence the elections. Because he doesn't have that much to stand on, really, you know.
I think one of the dynamics that journalists pointed out was that Bolsonaro was quite aggressive towards Vera Magalhães, who was a female journalist, kind of attacking her in public. And even though he insists that he's reaching out to women voters and trying to improve his popularity among them, which is relatively low, it didn't play very well in the press. What was your impressions of that interaction?
Well, Bolsonaro is actually, in the polls, it looks like women are 2-1 in favor of Lula. I mean, the main reason that Lula is in front in the polls is because of the poor making under 2 times the minimum wage and women. And this definitely didn't help him because it just made him look like a macho jerk. When he blew up he told the reporter that it's obvious that she has a crush on him because she's so obsessed with him. And then his comments about what he's doing for women was like this BS line, you know, that some people used to say in the 60s about, like, I'm doing things, you know, if I do something that helps men, it automatically helps women. So, like, you know, the strengthening gun rights helps women, strengthening property rights helps women as much as it helps men. My stance, my opposition to abortion helps women. And most ridiculously, my wife's, the first lady's volunteer work helps women. That was what he said he's doing for women. So it didn't come off very well, right? And that was key, I think, for a lot of people saying he was the worst performer in the debate.
So in the debate, there were 2 women candidates. One is Simone Tebet, who is from the Brazilian Democratic Movement. And it seems that the mainstream commentators are saying that she made a breakout performance success. My impressions is, so she's polling at 3% right now. Maybe it'll change because of the debate performance. But my impression is that the mainstream media, much of it, is still trying to insist that there's a third party alternative, a third candidate alternative to Lula and Bolsonaro. How do you make of this? You see Tebet gaining support before the election? Does she have any chance of upsetting the outcome, or does that change anything, do you think?
I think the only thing that could happen is that she could surge a bit and cause the election to go into the second round. I don't see her going above 5 or 6%. The bourgeois media, the hegemonic, whatever, the traditional media oligarchies in Brazil have been trying to build up a third-party candidate the entire time. It started with Sergio Moro, and the fact that guy Felipe Dávila is pulling at 0% just shows what people really think about this, like, 1980s IMF style privatization mantra that the third path is supposedly pushing. Like, no one falls for that anymore. And he was almost yelling, "We have to privatize everything." The guy's pulling at 0%. No one is buying this third path stuff anymore in Brazil at this point, and as in many places in the world. Now, one of the reasons the Brazilian media, but not the international media, pointed out or cited her as being having a breakout performance is that Datafolha conducted a poll in real time the night of the elections, and the result was that she had done the best performance and Ciro Gomes was second, whatever. But then if you look at what the poll was, it was a qualitative poll of 60 people, with no representative sample of the population. It's just like, it was misleading to even call that a poll, but a lot of media outlets just ran with that. It would be misleading to refer to that as like a valid election poll. And the media just ran with it. And also, as you say, they're just pushing her because, and she had some good moments. Like, to her credit, she did push back at Bolsonaro after he had that blow up at Vera Magalhães and defended her and things like that. And obviously that was important, but her promises for Brazil and things like that, I don't think had any appeal to the average voter.
I know there was one moment in which she made the comment that or someone made the comment that what would they do in terms of her women electorate? And Simone Tebet promised to make half of her cabinet female. And I was thinking, well, she can make that promise because she's got 2% of the votes, and that doesn't mean she's going to get elected and be president to do anything. Whereas when Lula was pushed to make that promise, he said, and I think fairly honestly, look, I'm not going to make promises that I'm boxed into. I don't know yet, and I don't want to later be called a liar for having not fulfilled a promise. So I can't guarantee that necessarily the cabinet will have any specific composition of people. But that raises another question about the debate and the representation, because you posted a thread on Twitter in which you highlighted the fact that two candidates, both of them who were on the left and both of them were Black, were left out of the debate, despite polling showing their similar support to the candidates to participate. And you point out that the electoral law requires people who have at least 5 representatives in Congress have the right for their party to have a candidate on the debate floor. But what does this mean when the possibility of listening to the voices of Black Brazilians who are candidates and polling equal or even better than some of the traditional right-wing candidates, white, who are in right-wing parties? What does that mean for Brazilian elections and for inclusion of marginalized people in Brazil?
Well, I think, first of all, the debate suffered by having, 4 candidates right of center, one who's kind of a centrist, a little bit center-left, you could argue, Ciro Gomes, although he's been attacking Lula for supporting abortion rights lately, and Lula, right? They suffered. It would have been nice to have another hard left candidate expressing more radical points of view, so that at the end, it would have taken some of the wind out of Bolsonaro's sails with his final closing speech, portraying basically Lula as a kind of baby-eating Stalinist or something, pulling out all the Cold War rhetoric. It would have been a little bit weaker if there had actually been a communist in the debate, like Leo Pericles from the UP party, or Vera Lúcia from PSU, who's a Trotskyist. Her platform for the presidency is interesting. She's promising to nationalize Brazil's 100 largest businesses, for example. And if she'd been there saying all this kind of stuff the whole night, Bolsonaro's accusations against Lula would have seemed that Lula's some kind of extremist wouldn't have had as much weight. It would have affected the debate significantly.
Right. And in a way, many people in the media portray this thing as a polarization between an extreme left and an extreme right, when many would argue that Lula is a moderate social democrat, a socialist, but not a revolutionary or radical as are other candidates in the race, which are all polling very low numbers, as are these right-wing candidates you pointed out. Well, there's one last person who is in the debate we haven't really talked about yet. You mentioned him in passing, Ciro Gomes, who was a former minister in the Lula government, but since then has been attacking both Bolsonaro and Lula. In fact, in the debate, blamed Lula for the election of Bolsonaro. So what are your impressions of Ciro Gomes, and how do you see him influencing the elections this go around?
Well, I've been following Ciro since 1991 when I first moved to Brazil. I lived in São Luís, Maranhão in 92 and 93, which is the next, pretty close to Fortaleza, during just at the end of his stint as governor there. And he had a good reputation as governor at the time. I remember his run for presidency in 2002 when his candidacy was destroyed by PSDB with a series of attack ads. He was doing pretty well in the polls, pointing out that, because he was billing himself as the creator of the Real Plan, and these attack ads just pointed out that he'd only been in the Itamar Franco government for 100 days, and he was just decimated with these really negative attack ads. He was a good minister. It seems to me like he's got some kind of anger deep inside about being maybe left out, not getting the kind of offer he wanted from the Dilma Rousseff administration, maybe. He's bitter against PT, and especially since the 2018 elections. At first, when Lula was in jail, he was sympathetic and calling it political imprisonment. Now he's repeating Bolsonaro's lies, as if the Lava Jato investigation had never been disgraced or undone or anything. He's acting as if that was still all valid. And his party, he switched parties 5 times, which is a sign of opportunism in Brazil. Normally, one of the first things I learned about Brazilian politics is that you shouldn't trust a politician who switches parties a lot. And I learned that in like 1992, and he's been in 5 parties. He started in the official government military dictatorship party of Arena when he was a teenager, when he first got into politics. He's been in PSDB. He was in the Itamar Franco government, and he's only been in PDT for a few years, I guess 5 years now. But PDT, has a kind of partially good reputation as a center-left Keynesian kind of party, but at the same time, it's not regionally coherent. So in some places, in some states, it's right-wing, in other states, it's left-wing. The PDT mayor of Campinas was conservative, for example.
And for our listeners, just so they were following your conversation, the PDT would be the Democratic Labor Party, and it emerged out of what traditionally was the Brazilian Labor Party, which had been a kind of left-center, pro-labor party that had elected Vargas in 1950 to office, and had the vice president, who became the president of Brazil before the military took over, was also in the party to which the legacy of which Ciro Gomes is currently a member. So please continue.
On a sidebar, Brizola, when he created this PDT party, he changed the name because some right-wingers had immediately registered the name the minute political parties were re-legalized in Brazil, so that you couldn't get it, But right. But PDT, for example, it didn't vote 100% against Dilma Rousseff's impeachment, for example. There were a few people who voted in favor. It doesn't have, with the retirement, the draconian, retirement reforms, pension reforms, they didn't vote 100% against them. And Ciro was mad at the time, whatever. But he doesn't have full control over that party. And now it's been infiltrated by this bizarre group of hardcore, right-wing Duganists called Novo Resistência, who have infiltrated the party, and they're representing themselves as a tendency within the party. And Ciro has never spoken out against them or anything. So it's a little bit weird.
He also was criticized pretty fiercely in the 2018 elections, because after he didn't take second place against Bolsonaro, when Fernando Haddad, representing the Workers' Party with Lula in prison, came in second place and therefore went into the second round, Ciro Gomes went to Paris and didn't comment on the elections. He didn't throw his support behind Haddad, even though at that point, any person who knew anything about politics knew exactly where Bolsonaro stood and where he was going. And so to not throw his hat or throw his support towards Haddad was basically allowing Bolsonaro to win the elections. And so he has been seriously criticized for having done that. And it's not clear whether he's going to do in the second round of the elections. When pressed on that, he didn't answer the question.
He's made comments to the extent that he would rather see anyone take office than PT, over the last year. I mean, he's all over the board. One day he'll say one thing, another day he'll say another thing, but it's depressing, and it seems like his existence in this race is to be a spoiler, to push the election to the second round so that Bolsonaro and his, backers, whatever, can regroup and try a new strategy to win the elections, or that it could strengthen their claims of voter fraud and give them justification not to accept the results of the election if it's closer.
There's another fascinating aspect to this election, which has been the transformation of former President Dilma Rousseff's public image? Because I remember when she lost her bid to represent Minas Gerais in the Senate 4 years ago, despite being heavily favored in the race in the polls before the outcomes, given her name recognition. But then she lost. And over the past year, it's been remarkable to see her reemerging as a powerful symbol of resistance to Bolsonaro. Do you agree with that? Can you see this shift in public perception, or am I reading it wrong?
No, yes, and I think it's been going for longer than that. I think, she was screwed over 4 years ago by these kinds of illegal big data targeting Cambridge Analytica style hate campaign against her in Minas that the electoral courts ruled actually happened. They ruled that the Bolsonaro and his allies had committed massive election fraud, but they didn't have the guts to order them, deposed last year. But they did promise that they won't let it happen again this year, right? But I think she was a victim of this kind of disinformation campaign. But I think every day that goes by, every month, every week that goes by since she left office, her reputation just grows. I mean, you think of someone like Jimmy Carter in the US, who's, more respected as an ex-president than a president even. In her case, I think a lot of respect for her presidency itself is returning. Remember, she hit the lowest unemployment rate in Brazilian history during her first term. And in her second term, as Lula pointed out in the debates, she was completely paralyzed from governing. And the president of PSDB party at the time admits and says it was a mistake that they actually paralyzed her government, starting with her second term, and didn't allow her to make any adjustments to this recession that was building, specifically to destabilize her so that she could be impeached.
So speaking of Congress and its importance in Brazilian politics, because it has a strong ability to block legislation, presidential legislation, and come up with its own initiatives. How do you see the congressional elections playing out? Do you think it's possible for the PT coalition of 10 political parties to get a leading role in a coalition in Congress to be able to actually carry out legislative changes?
I think it would be a first, right? It would be a first. I think they'll do well. I think PT is going to increase its number of members of Congress, as will PSB, and possibly some of the smaller parties in, PCDB, for example, in the coalition. I don't think they'll get a majority. I mean, let's face it, the only, presidents who are able to govern Brazil without inviting both MDB and, União Brazil, formerly DEM, formerly PFL, into their coalition were Lula and Dilma, and they still had to have MDB in the coalition. I think any way you look at it, they're gonna have to have one of those two big legacy parties from the dictatorship involved, which means they're not gonna Lula will have to govern by decree, with a lot of decrees, executive orders and things like that, or they'll have to make some deals with these guys.
Yeah, what I was surprised actually with Simone Tebet of the Brazilian Democratic Movement, which was the big core centrist bloc, which always built an alliance with whatever party was in power. And in fact, Dilma, in order to have a majority in Congress, agreed to accept as her vice presidential candidate Michel Temer, who later turned on her and led the impeachment of her to become president. I was really surprised that Simone Tebet didn't offer certain olive branches to Lula. I don't know if this is an attempt to be hardline now in order to negotiate something between the first and second round of the elections, should it come to that, or whether she will refuse to endorse Lula in the second round, although a significant part of her party will, and they've already declared their support for Lula in the first round. But so is there a way, do you think, that Lula can build a majority coalition in this context, or is he going to be forced to, as you say, rule from governmental decree, from presidential decree?
Well, last time around, he had like the inner circle of real allies, which was basically, PT, PCDB, which is the Brazilian Communist Party, which isn't that communist as you could imagine from their name, and PSOL, right, the first time around. And then he had his like outer circle allies, which was like PTB, PMDB at the time, as it was called, and some other center-right parties. And he managed to get, I mean, you could say he kind of like wasn't able to deliver on a lot of his promises, but he was able to deliver on some of the main promises, like ending hunger and things like that, with that kind of coalition. And I would love to see his coalition take a majority in Congress and the Senate, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be a similar setup to, and probably like PSDB will end up in the coalition as well, and probably MDB.
So, in other words, what you're suggesting is that Lula will build a broad coalition beyond those political parties supporting him currently in order to find a way to have some kind of working majority in Congress, even though there's not necessarily agreement on all questions. And this raises the question of an important sector of the Brazilian economy, which is agribusiness. It's pretty influential. It's a pretty influential force in Brazilian politics today. So if Lula wins, how do you see him dealing with the agro lobby?
Well, remember, they pleased the agro lobby the first time around in a lot of ways. I mean, I see him heavily pumping money into the environmental regulatory agencies and seizing as much as possible illegal logging and mining in the Amazon region, while placating agribusiness through subsidies and whatever in the areas where they're currently developing most of their soy and beef, like he did the Ministry of Agrarian Development was eliminated by Temer. But when Lula was president, I remember one year it was like there's the Agricultural Ministry, which he put in control of agribusiness. And then the Ministry of Agrarian Development was set up to assist family farmers. And so one year it was like he gave 32 million allocated to the Ministry of Agriculture and 31 million to the Ministry of Agrarian Development. When he left office, 70% of the food consumed in Brazil was still produced by family farmers. So unlike the US, which basically eliminated family farmers under Reagan, he managed to do this juggling act and please both sides, to the point where the main voices of family farmers in Brazil, the MST and CONTAG, still support PT to this day, even though they didn't get the agrarian reform that they've been fighting for. And key members in agribusiness, like the Maggi family, which the patriarch of the family owns a personal ranch larger than Switzerland, they're now supporting Lula as well in this election. So
it sounds like there's going to be a very interesting realignment of some political forces in this regard. In that regard, I'm thinking of Lula's promise to establish a ministry for indigenous affairs headed by an indigenous person. And that would mean, I would assume, strengthening of the defense of indigenous territories and really putting back the agency which is in charge of indigenous affairs in the hands of indigenous people, as opposed to ministers or Brazilian government functionaries who are against indigenous rights and indigenous land claims. How do you see that playing out?
Well, it's hard to say, because who's this person going to be? What's the budget going to be? I think it's an important step forwards, especially with considering that there's literally genocide going on against Brazil's 42 remote tribes that have no contact, with outsiders, which is like, Brazil's one of the last places in the world where you have thousands of people who have no contact with the outside world. I was in Rondônia during the first fire crisis in 2019, and one of the liberation theology priests who's been working with indigenous peoples for decades told me he thought that one tribe had just been eliminated.
Wow.
There's no more. So something drastic has to be done, and I think that would be a good first step.
Great. So let's talk about Bolsonaro. If he loses the election, is he out of the political picture, or does he have some lasting influence over politics in Brazil as Trump does in the United States?
One thing's for sure, his kids are going to have a lasting influence unless they're all jailed. I think it depends on how the legal stuff plays out. If everyone's saying Trump was going to be the next president of the US here down in Brazil, and now you look what they're doing to Trump. I think the FBI is pretty much guaranteeing that Trump will not be the next president in the US. And hopefully the Brazilian federal police will guarantee justice for the Brazilian people against all of the crimes that it strongly appears that Bolsonaro has committed. Enough crimes to have nearly 200 impeachment processes, on the floor against him. Including crimes against humanity for which he's been tried in, the process is moving forwards in The Hague, so hopefully they'll all end up in jail. If not, they're going to continue to have a strong influence. And I think that, Brazil's relatively unique style of fascism, which dates back to the 1930s with the integralists and everything, and the monarchy here, and new influences from the international far right, that's going to continue. And that's going to be a problem. Maybe, hopefully, it will go back, into the woodwork like it was before Bolsonaro took office. But I think it's going to be hard. I think there's going to be a big battle against, fascism, regardless of, what happens after Bolsonaro leaves office.
So the bicentennial celebration of Brazilian independence from Portugal is coming up on the 7th of September. And whereas this has traditionally been a place of military parades in Brasilia, in several capitals of different states, in Rio, for example, the tradition has been to have a military parade in the downtown area. Bolsonaro has called on his supporters to come to Rio, to come to Copacabana, the beachfront neighborhood of Rio de Janeiro, to attend what he fashions as to be a big celebration, including parachuters dropping in on the beaches, 21-gun salute from the historic fort, which is at the end of Copacabana Beach, people, fireworks and other activities, and promises a day-long activity of celebration, which some observers see as a way to promote his electoral campaign. How do you see the threat of some kind of illegal or illicit action, a coup or some January 6th style movement occurring in Brazil? What do you think Bolsonaro's up to?
Well, first of all, he's going to appear at two massive, September 7th celebrations. The Brasilia one at 2, which is also inviting everyone. And I was at that one last year, when they had been threatening to storm the Supreme Court. And it was scary. I was in a hotel full of Bolsonaro supporters, most of whom had been bussed in from small Midwestern towns. A couple asked me how to use the elevator. They'd never been in an elevator before. Another person very politely asked me how a vending machine worked. And so it looked like about 40% in my informal analysis of the people who went that day were just bussed in, poor people from small towns in the Midwest who were probably generally conservative and everything, but they were doing it for this free trip to Brasilia and staying in a hotel and everything. But that night, the truckers rode out onto the esplanade, onto the quad in front of all the government buildings, and rumors spread like wildfire across Brazil that they were storming the Supreme Court. And I was probably the only non-Bolsonaro fan in this hotel full of screaming drunks. And I began getting attacked online by Carlos Bolsonaro and his people. And I was really scared. And then after a few hours, I was thinking, like, what's going to happen? Do I have a way of getting out by land? Who do I know in Brazil who can get me to another town so I can get out by bus if there's a coup? And then Gleisi Hoffmann, the president of PT, sent out these tweets, series of tweets. She's like, look, they want everybody to be panicking right now, but this is a photo from in front of the Supreme Court. It's totally locked down. No one can come within 300 meters of the Supreme Court. It's completely guarded, okay? The truckers had a permit to come out onto the quad at midnight. What happened is they arrived 30 minutes early, and the police protecting the quad made a deal to let them come in early. They had a permit, so it looks like the fear that they generated through that action was the real political move. They were never actually planning on storming the Supreme Court, So this time around, they've been doing the same, they've kind of been suggesting the same thing, but it looks like Alexandre de Moraes, the Chief Justice of the Electoral Court, is making some kind of deal behind the scenes to diffuse the energy in both of these protests, Rio de Janeiro and Brasilia. I don't think anything's going to happen at all. I think it's just going to be a lot of conservative families, evangelicals, waving Brazilian flags and cheering. I was out on the quad filming for Telesur that next day, last September 7th. Every time a helicopter or a military jet flew over, people would raise their hands up like they were seeing Jesus and start screaming and stuff. It looked like I was in a Leni Riefenstahl Nazi propaganda film. That's what I felt like. It was really weird, but there was no sign of, violence whatsoever happening.
So your take of the situation, is it likely this is all bluff and blunder by Bolsonaro to mobilize to show his support by mobilizing a lot of people to the events?
Yes. I feel like any kind of anti-democratic move from him and the military would happen after the election.
Okay, when he challenges the results of the elections and claims that there's fraud in order to kind of shore up his base of support, much like Trump has done in his claiming that the elections are fraudulent. So let's jump into one last area, which is Lula's vice presidential running mate and former foe, Geraldo Alckmin, who was a member of the Brazilian Party of Social Democracy, but then moved to the Brazilian Socialist Party in order to be Lula's vice presidential candidate. It's a new alliance between the PT and the PSB. It's interesting because in addition to Alckmin, a number of other figures have moved from different political parties to the PSB, including Tabata Amaral from the center, the left former governor of the state of Maranhão in the north, who is currently a candidate for the Senate, Flávio Dino, and the Rio congressman and former and current gubernatorial candidate Marcelo Freixo. They're all in the PSB, the Brazilian Socialist Party. What do you make of this alliance, and what do you think the political role of it will be if Lula wins the elections?
Well, the PSB, had a pretty good reputation regionally. It's another one of these parties that is really just a coalition of regional power bases, traditional regional power bases. And in some states, especially the Northeast and in Belém do Pará, for example, there have been some really interesting PSB governments since the return of democracy from a progressive standpoint. In other states, like Rio de Janeiro, PSB has been a disaster. With Romário, the former football player, voting in favor of the impeachment, and most of them voted in favor of the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. And it's kind of like a party for hire, I think, in this situation right now. It's a good thing that some respectable left-wing politicians are joining to give it new blood. And I'm not talking about Alckmin there, obviously, because Alckmin to me is like a symbol of corporate Democrats. The corporate Democrats traditionally loved the PSDB. Fernando Henrique Cardoso was, one of Bill Clinton's favorite politicians in the Americas, and they imploded due to the backlash after their protagonism in the coup against Dilma Rousseff in 2016, to the point where every election, from the 90s forward had been ended up as a runoff between either a first round victory for Cardoso or a runoff between PSDB and PT. And then all of a sudden in 2018, Alckmin only got 4% in the national vote. The party is basically dying, and he felt like his political career was over. And I understand he feels like he's been given a new life, and he's really enjoying campaigning with Lula. I've been to campaign events and seen him speak. This doesn't erase his really lousy human rights record as Sao Paulo governor, even though I've never met a military police officer in Sao Paulo, and my ex had many in her family who had nothing but hatred for Alckmin. And the Sao Paulo military police hate PSDB. But under his governorship, they committed human rights atrocities, right? And ultimately, he's responsible for them. Nevertheless, I think his selection as vice was like a master realpolitik style chess move, because first of all, it opened up the Sao Paulo governorship for PT. PT's never had a governor of Sao Paulo, which is Brazil's second largest and second richest government after the federal government. So Alckmin was the favorite candidate for governor. He left. It was tied between Marcio França from PSB party and Fernando Haddad. They convinced Marcio França, as part of the coalition of Geraldo Alckmin entering, the party, to run for senator. And then Haddad selected Marcio França's wife as his vice candidate. And this has put him in double-digit lead for the governorship over every other candidate. On top of that, Alckmin's political protege is Alexandre de Moraes. Alckmin gave him his first important cabinet position in a state government, and now he was put into the Supreme Court by Temer, and he's turned into the biggest enemy of Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's followers in the government. They're treating him like the QAnon people treated Hillary Clinton, basically. Now, he's not a leftist or anything, but he's promised to prosecute anyone who tries to commit the same kinds of fraudulent big data, Cambridge Analytica style tactics that happened in 2018. He said, now we know how they work. We're going after everybody. And as you certainly know, he just issued search warrants in the houses of 8 of Brazil's most powerful businessmen, supporters of Bolsonaro, and froze all their assets for planning a coup d'etat if Bolsonaro loses the election. So his position, his relationship to Alckmin's position in the Lula administration is very important right now.
And as you mentioned, so Alexandre de Moraes is the head of the president of the Brazilian Electoral Court, which is a body that's separate from the Supreme Court, but members of the Supreme Court serve on the Brazilian Electoral Court. And so in that role, he has a very important role, position in dealing with potential electoral fraud or irregularities in the elections. He'll be the person who announces the results of the election on October 2nd, several hours after the polls close. So finally, Brian, are you optimistic or pessimistic about Brazil and its future?
Guardedly optimistic.
Why is that?
Because there's nowhere in the world where fascism has ever lasted very long, because the promises that fascists make to the working class, they never deliver on them. And I don't see the Brazilian people really embracing, this kind of image of Brazil that Bolsonaro is trying to, propagate. I think most Brazilians don't feel comfortable with it. So I'm guardedly optimistic.
Any last thing you'd like to share with us before we end the interview?
No, not really. Just let's keep our fingers crossed. That's all I can say.
Brian, I'm really happy that we could talk today. Thank you so much for joining us on Brazil Unfiltered.
And thank you for coming on my election show and speaking to me in Portuguese on the night of Trump's election. It's a pleasure to speak with you in English now.
Any time. Well, so I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.